Okay, hello everyone, and welcome. Today I'm talking to Howarth from Perspective Philosophy, and we're going to have a conversation about theistic and non-theistic or different perspectives on evidence relating to theism, right? And the way this came about is probably a good platform to launch into the conversation. So there was a tweet by a guy called Sygart, who people might be familiar with. He's a Christian and a scientist, and he does a lot of apologetics in like a particular kind of like strand of Christianity, I would say, and a particular approach to apologetics that he has. And I think he made, I can't remember exactly what the claim was that he made, but it was something like, people who say that there's no evidence for theism are like really misinformed, was the gist of what he said. And I responded to that saying, well, I don't think there's any evidence for theism, right? But I'm happy to talk about why that is, which is a little bit hyperbolic, such is the nature of Twitter. But I think it is actually a defensible position, and I'll kind of make a little bit of the case for that, and we can talk about like whether or not that's right. But just to set the stage, is that kind of, and then obviously you replied to me and said, well, I'm happy to talk, and I was like, well, great, because sometimes people don't really want to move forward when they disagree, and you just, which is good, and how we ended up here. So is that approximately your recollection?
Yeah. I mean, like mostly when I responded, it was a bit of a not in terms of how to when we said that I'd talk. That was 100%. I'm happy to talk. Good faith and stuff. When I first responded, it was a bit of a meme. Like I just posted a picture of like a shocked Leibniz. You know what I mean? It's like, but that's just like as the nature of Twitter again. Like where it's like it's the most academic of platforms. But yeah, 100%. I'm happy here to talk.
So if I kind of just open up with,
apparently,
okay?
apparently you can hear me. No one else can.
Okay, cool. Do you need to add desktop audio or something as an output on StreamYard? If your mic's connected to here, and
it should be able to
oh,
connect to both. It's just I know it's going to be doing
okay.
it, and
Yeah, don't worry. I'll wait a sec then. Before
yeah, I'm very sorry.
it's absolutely fine. Don't worry. No one is
there it
shaming
is.
you in the chat. No, okay.
Yeah. There we go. It's sorted. Sorry. It's the reason it does that is just it changes the device. But yeah. So for those of you in my chat,
Yeah.
you was just explaining how this conversation came about, and it was basically a sort of memey Twitter engagement, but has led to a fruitful conversation. So hopefully a fruitful
Hopefully, yeah.
conversation.
We'll see.
So
To be
we'll
confirmed.
see.
Okay, so to clarify then, like my perspective on this, right, is that I think there's a kind of like meme here within the apologetic space, which there is some amount of truth to, right? And that is the idea that people will often, in a very unreflective way, say there's no, they'll make demands for evidence that God exists or something, right? And they're not really clear what they mean by evidence, or they have like a very strange perspective on evidence where they seem to mean something like where God's a scientific theory or something, or they just mean something that's like a little bit weird by that, and if they just thought about it a bit more, they might realize, well, there's all sorts of different kind of evidence outside of like maybe scientific criteria, but also theists will say they're giving some scientific criteria with maybe things like fine-tuning or whatever. And so I think that there's like that part of the discourse, and that is right when theists kind of get wound up by people taking that perspective. But then the response to that, I think, is this kind of reflexive, yeah, look how stupid these people are, which I mean, I get it. I also kind of think it's a little bit stupid. But I think there's a bit beyond that where it might actually be the case that, okay, I've thought about things. I'm actually aware of, say, what fine tuning means, like psychophysical, all of the like various different arguments. And actually, I don't see how any of these things that I've considered do sort of like make me consider theism more after looking at them. I either don't see them as like genuine phenomena that I need to kind of include in my worldview, or I don't they don't move me to theism over some kind of like competing explanation of reality or something like that. Like, actually, maybe I've reflected on these things and it's made me more convinced of naturalism because I've refined my views on mind and nature and so forth. So that's just to set the perspective where I'm coming from. I think I do think the claim maybe there's no evidence at all could potentially be a little bit hyperbolic, right? Maybe in like a trivial sense you could figure out like, there's something that I'm not sure. So I can give examples of the types of things that I want to say, but not to bring up too many things at once. If you want to kind of respond to.
Oh yeah. I mean, like, I think I see what you're aiming at. So just before this, like, as in, like, not within the last hour, I watched your video on, I think, talking about why I think there's no, I think it's why I think there's no evidence for God.
Yeah.
Oh,
I worded it. There's no evidence for God, just to make it a bit more like clickbait.
And from what I understood, like, what you were really saying is that you didn't find that the evidence didn't hit a sufficient criterion such that it was something that you should take heed of or consider in terms of your sort of a epistemological process. So that, in the same way that, a flat earther may point towards the fact that when you look out to a horizon, it appears flat. That might be evidence, but it's maybe not evidence that you would consider worthy of contemplation in terms of actually proving the Earth being flat, right? That
or maybe you reflect on it. You reflect on it, and you think, and you find out all this stuff about like different perspectives and like stuff going over the horizon. You're like, well, actually, now this piece of evidence, now I've thought about it, moves me even more in favor of like round Earth than that kind of thing.
Which I see. I think I see what you're saying there. I guess that there's specific points where I don't think that, like, obviously, as a theist, I'm going to say obviously that I think there is evidence for God.
Yeah.
But I think more than that, I think it's like, I think that it's almost like, as you say, kind of hyperbolic. It's almost like a semantic point of, if evidence is like something, let's say, like facts which indicate the truth of a hypothesis or a truth of a proposition, then that it's what we give almost the epistemic weight of that indication is really, I think, what you kind of calling into question. It's in the same way I could say that, there's evidence for Bigfoot and the Loch Ness monster, or things like that. It's whether that would be given have the sort of credence necessarily to be considered something that you'd spend your time researching. But as you say, more than that, there is this the point of, once you even engage with that, the facts themselves might have been mischaracterized. There mightn't even be facts which even indicate the conclusion that's being referenced, such as like the Nessie picture. Once you analyze that, it's actually definitely not the Loch Ness monster, so there is, I think I see where you're going with that. Obviously I'm going to argue against that in terms of, I think there are some arguments which are, I think, weighty arguments which lend themselves to a theistic position, and that's where I would sort of argue from.
Yeah, and I think we can talk about those. I just want to make sure we're kind of on the same page about the evidence stuff, right, at the start as well. So that sounds good so far. So to give an example of the sort of thing that I think could be, like, if I'm saying there's actually there's another point to raise first, which would just be, there's a sense in which, obviously, if you're a theist and you say that your theism is the upshot of like rational considerations and things rather than something else, well, then it's kind of like, well, obviously you're going to think there's evidence for God's existence, and that the total amount of evidence weighs in that direction. Obviously, if you're an atheist, you're going to, as the upshot of rational consideration as well, rather than something else, you're going to say, yeah, the total amount of evidence weighs in that direction, so there's going to be some evidence. I think, though, maybe the point I was raising is, I think there's actually kind of consistent versions of both theism and atheism out there that are sort of rationally permissible, and not just rationally permissible in like, I mean, the bar for consistency or something is pretty low, right? You can believe like very few things and be consistent. But I think there's like sort of even normal versions of theism or normal versions of atheism or naturalism or something, which might just say, yeah, there isn't actually anything I consider to be like evidence in favor of the opposite hypothesis here. If I like compare theism and naturalism or something, well, then it just turns out that everything I think about weighs in favor of theism, or vice versa. And I don't think you have to be like a fundamentalist crazy person to sort of adopt that perspective. Yeah,
100%. Yeah, I actually had that very thought. When we're coming into this, I'm like, from my perspective, in some respects, I would almost take the inverse. Like, there is no evidence for atheism. Like,
right.
not to be like a bit hyperbolic, right? Because there's a metaphysical baggage there, right? It's like, okay, if I accept the principle of if the principle of sufficient reason is true, then I would argue that in order to give sufficient reason for any position or any object in terms of analysis, even probabilistically, almost the posterior hypothesis of God is 100% then, right? Like, almost like from a purely rational or a priori argumentation. So it this is where you'll get some theists who will say atheists do believe in God in the sense of having a sort of as a truth maker, almost as a kind of in a very thin sense. They'll say like they thinly accept God in the sense of it being like a fundamental unchanging truth or something like
it's
that.
like so if you from their perspective, if you perceive some object that's kind of connected to a bunch of other claims about the way the world is, so just to perceive that object is in some sense to know God's existence.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I think I would probably agree in some respects, because I do affirm the principle of sufficient reason, which obviously, I mean, it's hyperbolic in the same sense that obviously I don't think that they're like all atheists are just like irrational, like denying God's existence for like where is he, but it comes to the point of like obviously whose metaphysical argument is essentially correct. Like, should we affirm the principle of sufficient reason? Should we affirm, in terms of how should we understand metaphysics in general and epistemology in general, so that such that we gain truth? So I mean, all of this is very much tied in and nuanced to the point in which I think it's certainly fair to say that there are theists out there, and certainly theistic positions, once you adopt them and argue from that position, or atheist positions, once you adopt and argue from that position, evidence of the contrary is a non-entity.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like we very much agree on a lot of things so far, which is all very good. And then, so maybe I'll just say, in terms of like a counter to my position, there's maybe like one good case I could think of that might, in some sense, be considered like trivial evidence of theism, right? And if you take the hypothesis of theism to make some claim about minds existing as something, and maybe you compare that to a hypothesis of naturalism, where minds are instead particular types of physical states that aren't like guaranteed by the hypothesis to arise out of that world or something. You might think, well, the fact that minds exist as something and updating on that is evidence of theism. I'm genuinely, though, not sure where I land on this, only because the sense in which mind is meant for the theistic hypothesis is so different to my mind in almost every respect, right? It's like it has causal powers I sort of don't understand, where like action at a distance somehow, and disembodied, and it's omniscient, and it's like perfect, and it's three persons, like it's so different in so many ways that I'm not even sure if I should consider it. At what point would I consider it like the same sort of thing or a different type of thing? I'm not exactly sure.
Similar to, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead. That's all right.
I was just going similar to Hume's sort of criticism. The idea of how is this analogous to how can God's mind be analogous to a human mind? And I think that's fair. And I mean, to be fair, I don't agree with Hume. And I was actually arguing against Ben Watkins because he makes the Humean account. Because I mean, I'm post-Kantian German idealist, so I think Hume was wrong, and I take the Kantian approach. And so when I talk about a mind, I'm going to be fairly. I'm going to talk about essentially like a sort of categorical relation, or a unity of apperception, as Kant would call it, and stuff like that. But I think it's certainly fair to say, depending upon the theistic account and the metaphysical account given, if you can't, like, there has to be and you have to be able to give a definition for a mind, which gives an account for your mind being what it is, and your experience of mind, and also an absolute mind, such that it is a perfect, immutable existence, which doesn't ever really change, which is
Yeah.
a tall order, So I can understand why that would essentially. It seems like if you're just arguing from the point of analogy, it's like obviously the analogy is what makes this contingent object remotely similar to this
Exactly.
perfect necessary being, because it can't even really necessarily be put as an object. I think you can do that. I think that, but again, I can see why that would cause problems. Again, it depends on, like, it's going to be like the sort of the sort of standard motto of this conversation. Depends on your metaphysics. What a surprise.
Okay. So maybe then, yeah. So I'm kind of glad we agree on all that stuff, because I thought maybe there'd be some disagreement around that, but it sounds like we actually broadly think about a lot of those things in a similar or the same way. So maybe it would be good then just to kind of turn it over to you a bit, because I mean, obviously there are going to be some kind of substantive differences in our approaches to philosophy, our views of metaphysics, and so forth. And to say, is there do you think it would be best then to discuss some particular piece of evidence that you think I'm mistakenly considering as not evidence at all, or that I'm not kind of assessing in the right way, as where I should be assessing it as favoring theism or something? Do you think that would be a good direction?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way I typically argue for the existence of God, or the arguments that sort of convinced me, I was first convinced by arguments given by Hegel in the Science of Logic, where he argues from an ontological stance. And he argues from a point in which the ontological argument, if you accept his ontology, the ontological argument, I would argue he's right and says it holds, right? But he sort of says, like, tongue in cheek in a way, that it holds almost in the sense that you've already presumed the existence of a perfect mind, even if you don't have knowledge of that perfect mind and its perfection. So he kind of accepts the Thomistic refutation whilst also saying, but Thomas is wrong, right? Like, so really the way that I would, and the way that I think you would kind of have to establish the sort of foundations for this is to say that there's the principle of sufficient reason, that you'd have to, that there must exist a necessary being. I think from that point, if you can establish from the principle of sufficient reason, I think you can establish that anything which contains its own reason is divinely simple. And you can argue for divine simplicity, or just like a perfect simplicity. And then I think from that point, you can argue for from the Thomistic standpoint, that simplicity implies the sort of omni traits of God. I also think that in terms of how you give an account for mechanism, when we look at like mechanistic approaches to understanding reality, are typically towards naturalism, like in terms of naturalism. So we might look towards, let's say, whether it's like evolutionary accounts for the development of life, which is fair, right? I want to say first, I do actually accept evolution before anyone thinks I don't. I swear I accept evolution. Please don't think I don't. Right? But I don't think evolution and mechanism itself can work correctly without a consideration of teleology. So there is a kind of teleological argument there, that I think that if you accept mechanism and you say mechanism exists, and then if you come to the conclusion that mechanism implies necessarily a teleology, and that teleology, I think, from a teleological argument, I think you can get to God as well. So like those are the real main. So in many ways, mirroring Aquinas's 5 proofs, except I prefer Leibniz over like Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason over the argument from motion. I very much like the. I would also say that Hegel's argument in terms of ontology gets us to the Trinity, which Aquinas doesn't believe you can do, and I like that. And specifically that there's a teleological component in reality. So I think if you accept those things, like mostly for the fact that obviously this all depends on your metaphysics, it depends on a lot of things. So I can't just go, this is
Yeah,
always
yeah,
going to be necessarily evidence for the existence of God, because you might say, and we'd need to have a conversation on it, a necessary being isn't necessarily a mind, or a necessary being or an absolute end, like goal, like a teleology, a natural telos, doesn't imply again a mind or a god, right? So
yeah.
there has to be a point in which you sort of go through those concepts and sort of and work them out. But really, I think the principle of sufficient reason is probably the bedrock where we could start.
Yeah, so we can start. I think just to highlight some differences I have in my view. So, like in terms of my thinking around metaphysics and my approach to philosophy, I'm generally quite skeptical of like metaphysical principles, and attempts to kind of construct like grand theories of reality, right? Based off of such principles, and a lot of this is also going to be connected to my views of language, where I'm going to think that a lot of philosophical use of language is just parasitic on ordinary discourse. So, for example, philosophers will often have borrowed some term from sort of like some ordinary language. Obviously, philosophers speak lots of different languages, and then attempted to kind of offer a deep analysis of that term in some way, that's kind of either immune to counterexample or connected to some like deeper theory of reality in some way. And I think a lot of my kind of meta philosophy is resistant to lots of those attempts, because I don't see there as being any requirement to do any such thing. So, like when you say like reason, for example, you might mean something by it, whereas by like reason, I might mean a much more modest type thing, right? Which is something that a word you can use in particular context to maybe you're asking someone about the history leading up to some event, or maybe you're asking someone for some extra bit of information you need. That's how the word is used ordinarily. But then in the but for reason in general, I might think that there's no such thing, right? So there's one kind of aspect, right, to my disagreement here, which will stem from metaphilosophical disagreement, where I'm resistant to almost the whole project in the first place of doing philosophy this way. But I can also, if that is not a good place to start as well.
No, that's a perfect place. I think no, I think why not start at the very beginning, right? If we're like, I think that's
sure.
like,
yeah.
So if you would like to just so
I was only going to say the only additional thing I was going to say is like, but then I can sort of accept certain assumptions and do philosophy in that way, and be like, well, I think on the assumption that we want to provide some deeper concepts for these things and like produce a metaphysical theory, then I as an illustrative example, I think I can adopt a kind of naturalism, not because I'm like thoroughly convinced of it, but just because I think that it illustrates then the problems that I see with the way that the theistic argument is meant to go through, and that should, at the least, I would say, justify like a kind of agnosticism or something, and maybe at most justify people to pervert that sort of theory and maybe towards a type of atheism and rationally. So that's like my whole view there. Feel free to
Yeah, I mean, like, I think the best place to start is probably where you said, like, in terms of metaphilosophy and just seeing like how you approach philosophy in general. So I mean, I see philosophy um is very much tied to the actual thinking process in general, such that I think that it is the unification of essentially of all sort of, I mean, like, in terms of, in one respect, it sort of unifies human thought um in a Hegelian sense. So like the philosophy of the time, you might say, like, it was it defines the ways in which we think and understand, and the sort of conceptual frameworks in which we engage in, and that when we're doing philosophy, it's almost an analysis of the sort of concepts that we're using at the time in relation to our experiences, and in another respect, the actual like in a more sort of fundamental sense, what the reason it's doing that is because it's an exposition and a search for truth itself. I see that philosophy is as a fundamental attempt to reconcile oneself, in the very Socratic sense of to know thyself, right? To reconcile oneself with reality and to pursue truth to the greatest degree possible, a kind of fidelity towards um, uh, well, not necessarily rational. I think that might put too much in there, but towards maybe understanding correctly, or in the sort of Greek love of wisdom, such that you live your life in a way which actually reflects the way in which you should live your life, as a kind of yardstick or a guiding structure, which then can be used to test all of the other epistemological structures around it. So whether you're engaging in terms of art or science or whatever, you can use sort of philosophy as a means of gauging whether you are performing your task correctly. And I think that's why at the end of all subjects you get a doctor of philosophy in this respect.
Yeah. So on that point, I don't know that I would disagree with the things you've said insofar as, like, there are certainly many people's goals in philosophy are in line with what you said, and a lot of people throughout history have seen themselves as doing that sort of thing. I think my view probably just has a bit more in there as well. So I wouldn't say that those things are sort of essentially what philosophy is or something, because I think that I could point to some academic philosophers who I think are just doing it as, like a look how smart I am crossword puzzle or something, right? And I'd say they're just, I mean, obviously from your view you might say, well, they're not really doing philosophy, right? But I think I would say, well, they're employed in a philosophy department, they publish in these philosophy journals, they talk to these people, and so for me, I'm going to also call that philosophy. But I'm not going to say that is essentially what philosophy is either. I'm going to maybe point to a whole kind of host of different kind of like goals or values or purposes people might have, and call all those things philosophy. And I agree, it's going to be very difficult. I think it's going to be very difficult to actually characterize that as just like one thing that everyone signs up to, because there's so many different things people do that they say, it's almost like trying to find the truth maker for transness or something. Like what do all trans people have in common? There's all sorts of different things people say. And I think, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I suppose that, I'd be happy to say that those motivations exist. And I mean, like, as in the kind of Hegelian sense, like it is the sort of thoughts of the time. And so like the system of needs, and the reason that people engage in philosophy is almost part of the philosophical enterprise. But it's in the sense that we are sort of intellectually or intellectualizing, if you will, about ourselves and reality. That I think is the fundamental bedrock, such that we, like, in the sense that I don't think that you can kind of get around the sort of core, maybe like all men desire to know kind of thing, that the Aristotelian approach that I think sort of forms the core component of this sort of truth seeking that I'm referencing. Such that as long as you're trying to get something, I think you're trying to do it. But again, like, I agree that, people might say that they're not doing that, right? There's a part of us that's, like, there's some people who I think aren't doing philosophy, where I think that they'll say they're doing philosophy, they're not doing philosophy. But I think those people are more like, I'd rather characterize those people that are like that as being intellectually disingenuous, like the lying or being deceitful deliberately, kind of sophistically. Those are the kind of people where I'd say they're not doing philosophy. It's not that like the people who say I'm only doing it for fun or I'm doing it for a paycheck. I still think they're doing philosophy. I don't think they're doing it in the way that I think it should be done, and I don't think they're doing it well in that respect. But I still think they're doing it. But I think that the reason that I would say specifically the dishonest people aren't doing philosophy is because it seems that they're not necessarily playing the game or the practice of philosophy, such as that it's no longer an exercise in which we are even sharing the same concepts or communicating in a way that we're actually conveying information. You're actually actively trying to deceive me, which means like it's kind of like cheating in chess. It's like you're not playing chess anymore. And that so that's probably how I'd respond to that.
Do you think on that point, do you think that there are any people who are not trying to actively deceive you, and they're not seeking some kind of like profound sense of knowledge about the unity of the world or something, but they just enjoy producing logical proofs or something? They just kind of see it like a game, and they've got the intellectual abilities to do it, or those sorts of things. Do you think they? Yeah,
I still think they're doing philosophy. I just think that I think that they're doing philosophy in the same ways that I think reason isn't subjective, but like endemic to a culture, right? That they're playing that they're doing philosophy institutionally, maybe not themselves as a person who's doing it. Like it depends on whether they have that fidelity to the sort of root, maybe virtues or root practices of the subject, such that again, they're not trying to, let's say if they're given the opportunity to gain, let's say, logical proofs and stuff, as long as they're given logical proofs, that's great. They're still doing the practice. But let's say they're doing something like I don't know, they're writing journal articles, but let's say they're, I don't know, it's Chat GPT, or I don't know, that they're doing it in order to maybe make a political statement or write a manifesto. I don't know. Then if it's not about, let's say they're using it as a means to sort of spread I don't know, an ideology or something totally separable, without, they haven't really considered it. They're not even wanting to consider it. They're not even necessarily convinced of what they're saying, but they're using it for an ulterior motive. Then I think they're using, it's they're not playing the same game then. So then I would probably say they're not doing philosophy in that respect. But I think that people could do it without being, let's say, personally motivated, if you will.
Yeah. I think there was something you said as well about in your view of philosophy, the way that the ideas of philosophy kind of connect to broader culture and the ideas of the time. I think was what you, something along those lines was what you said. And I think maybe my view would just differ in a little bit, not completely, just insofar as, rather than there being this kind of the philosophical ideas and things that people come up with almost go out into culture, I think I'd probably say that most of the time it's sort of the other way around, right? And like what philosophers are doing is almost like a post hoc rationalization of where they've got to, usually because of like economic forces and political forces and things outside their control. Maybe you agree with this to some degree, but I think I would just I wouldn't deny that there have been cases where philosophers have done something and then that's kind of disseminated into culture. But I think, on my view, it'd be almost more pessimistic about the role that actually does play, and maybe lean more towards most of the time it's the other way around, and there's lots of things going on in other subjects or in the world at large, and economics and politics, and then there's kind of like people who are doing philosophy who are trying to piece that stuff together, and not in a pejorative way tell stories, but tell stories about it that are consistent and can make sense of it for them and people who are interested in the way they are.
Yeah, I think that there is certainly I think that it's necessarily the case that philosophy is not synonymous with the academic institution and discipline of performing philosophy. I think that when I say philosophy is this sort of cultural, sort of culturally and endemic, I mean embodied in the lived experiences of people trying to really just live their own lives. But I think there's a philosophy there, and a true philosophy there that I think philosophers are trying to tap into.
And that's Hegelianism.
I mean, I'm actually expressing Hegelianism as I say this. That's the thing. So, yeah. But I think that's the truth of it. Isn't to say that there is there's one philosophy for all ages. Or rather, there might be, but we mightn't have that yet. It might be the philosophy, the end of history, that kind of thing, But I think
18th century Prussia.
Yeah, well, that's where it ended, man. I've got to go back. But I think what I'm very skeptical of is a sort of anti-philosophy, sort of Marxist typically it's the Marxists who usually argue for, let's say, a purely economic, material conception of forces, which then alienates philosophy to the point of a kind of ideological construct, usually manipulating and separating people from the truth of reality. And I think that I mean, I normally have a problem with that, not only because I'm a philosopher, but I have a problem with that because that in and of itself is a philosophy, that is presuming a metaphysic of reality, a metaphysic that being true, in order to justify itself and a sort of anti-philosophical case. It's kind of like trying to destroy philosophy with philosophy. It's like, okay. And I think that Heidegger makes a similar point where it's like, even have this sort of revolution, even have, like, there comes the thought of needing to change society and understanding society before you say, actually, let's change it. So I do think that there is this sort of implicit, and I think this is what you're sort of referencing, that there is this implicit movement of ideas that sort of exists, that philosophers maybe reflect upon. So like the Copernican turn, or like the I don't know, the Reformation and things like that, these massive historical events which are showing conceptual changes that have not originated in philosophy departments, right? At least largely, like, and instead the philosophers might even amplify or make more apparent these points. But I think that's I mean, that's absolutely fine with me. I think that there's nothing wrong with saying that. And then again, sometimes, as you say, sometimes philosophers have an impact and sort of characterize and move history along as well.
I guess then, I mean, there's stuff I could say about the point you made about pessimism too, because I think I'm quite like very pessimistic really about the status and goals of philosophy, and I kind of I'm not really moved by the kind of self-refutation type arguments here, because so insofar as I'd agree that you have to kind of do philosophy if you want to then engage in a philosophical discussion about why philosophy is bad, but then I think so maybe the best thing to do is just to kind of leave that to the philosophers and do something else, like maybe work on a better defined question or something.
That's it. Like, but I think it's one of those things where it's more than that. There's a sort of characterization of philosophy, and I think that we'll risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater when we say there's philosophy. When we make philosophy just, let's say, like a conversation between a few people at university, rather than maybe what people are doing in their everyday lives.
I definitely agree with that, right? Like, in the sense that I don't like the academic ivory tower nature of a lot of like Anglo-American type philosophy and its inaccessibility and things. Though I think we probably will slightly disagree on this, because when I talk about philosophy being more accessible to people, I probably mean something a lot more kind of modest, like, which would be, just giving people like critical thinking tools and things to help them be a bit clearer about ways they might be manipulated, or think about like political issues or scientific, maybe not adopt like super naive views of science that lead them to bit bizarre sorts of like maybe anti-religious views and things. But I don't mean as much. I don't mean as much as like people getting really into heavy duty metaphysics and sitting around talking about that, and that needs to be spread a bit more or something. Maybe that's not exactly what you mean, but I think your view might be a little bit more in that direction than mine.
I mean, probably. I mean, like, I love metaphysics, right? I really do. And like, I mean, in the sense that I think what we need to do is, I don't think that everyone has to be a philosopher and like a kind of, or at least like deeply philosophically invested. I think that what we need to do, what really needs to happen, is the sort of fundamental presuppositions of the time, I think, often need challenged and sort of questioned, and that's sort of interdisciplinary anyway, such that like teaching people critical thinking skills is sort of a preliminary first step necessarily, I think, to this in some respects. But I think one of the bigger problems that we have in many ways culturally is also the proliferation of perverse philosophies, like bad philosophies that are kind of formed ideological blocks that people engage in politically. So then you've got you've got people who sort of reason through philosophy. So it's more and more like a problem for, I think, our generation. Like the previous generation has its own ideological problems, traditionalists versus sort of skepticism. Our generation has this sort of very much post-structuralist competing narrative problem, I think, where you see people are just adopting like what I think are largely, usually, if you have any critical thinking skills, shit, absolutely shit. Like, use the word to be frank about it, worldviews, very dogmatically, whether it's religious or whether it's secular, like political and stuff like that, where you gain like and usually are quite fundamentally committed to these things, and I think that one of the things that philosophy has more than anything is a commitment, and I feel like very much at the early days of philosophy, and I think this is where we really need to pull it back to, not like the academic philosophy today, but this idea of having a conversation at the marketplace where you're really just pissing each other off, kind of, but at the same time having the conversation, and that that kind of Socratic approach where you recognize that there is, you're willing to engage with each other in a kind of way that's very well switched on, very maybe is a dialectical, or
well, I think you have to recognize the sort of dignity in other people as well in order to do that, right?
Exactly. You sort of have to respect and have empathy, very much have empathy. This is sort of McIntyre's point about politics today. But as well, you've also got to have a kind of commitment to something outside of yourself. Now, that doesn't have to be a kind of, like a god or something like that, but it could, this is where I'd say like something like truth that leads you to sort of an epistemic humility, where you're willing to go, oh, actually I might be wrong, and I think until we're ready to, or maybe I was arguing with a Thomist today, and he's making some really good points, and I'm like, oh man, I don't want to have to be a Thomist, and it's one of those points where you kind of have to go, well, maybe I need to adopt the opposite position, and it's having the willingness to do that, and I think that that's the sort of virtues, that the philosophical virtues, if you will, where it's just that sort of intellectual approach, I think is probably the most important thing that philosophy could do for society.
So to circle back to a kind of point I heard you made that, and I'm making some interpretive assumptions, so correct me if any of this is wrong. Like when you mentioned that a lot of people might be adopting sort of fairly uncritical or inconsistent or even irrational positions due to being in this kind of like post-structuralist tradition, that I think I would even place myself somewhere in this. I mean, I'm relatively. I think I have problems with post-structuralism insofar as I think that my views are like kind of anti-representational about mind, right? So this idea of signifier and the sign and stuff, I'm a little bit like, I don't understand the need for these representations. But to put that stuff to one side, like I've firmly kind of consider myself postmodernist, for example. Mm-hmm. But what I tend to find is actually that there are people on a particular side of these discussions. So typically like kind of what I would call the heterodox right, because, I consider myself actually a woke conservative. So my views politically in the UK are conservative. Americans may disagree. And in the sense that, I'm for certain traditions and things, and certain things I would consider British values. But I see my views as being perfectly consistent with postmodernism actually, and then I find that people who are maybe a bit further right than me, or definitely in this kind of heterodox space where they're rejecting a lot of traditional epistemic authorities and things like that in favor of what online communities say, I tend to find that those people paint a picture of, well, I've got these ideological opponents out here who are they're just crazy pro-trans woke people or something, right? Mm-hmm. But they say this a lot, and even though I can find some examples of that, I really tend not to find it's actually representative. I actually don't think I've ever found anyone who's like that isn't like purely just driven by some kind of emotional response to the topics.
Oh, I completely agree. Yeah,
rather than it being like the upshot of some kind of reflection about 19th century views of language, and just being, I just got really interested in linguistics. So then I read some Derrida or something, and now what do you know, I'm like really angry about trans rights or something. I've like basically never come across that.
No, it's probably like, I think a lot of the time you'd be like, psychoanalyze it and be like, it's their own insecurity or something along those lines a lot of the time, and things like that. I mean, it's funny that you say that, you're you call yourself like a kind of like, what did you say, a woke conservative?
Well,
I call myself I call myself a progressive Catholic, so it's one of those things. But I'm arguing for like homosexual marriage in the church. You know what I mean? I just say, so.
Well, you're with the Pope on that one, but some of the Catholics are ready to say he's not the real Pope. Just to,
well, I think that the Pope certainly not went that far. Like, but there is this.
They can give blessings.
Yeah, the blessings, but the person's not the. Anyway, but there's a whole thing. I think we should be willing to accept homosexual.
But they're really arguing against you that the Pope is not Catholic. The sedevacantist.
Oh, there's actually like there's 100% people. There's like, you're not seeing this, like people posting pictures of like the statue of Saint Peter on the Pope's birthday and stuff like that, where it's had like been hit by lightning, and they're like, it's a sign from God. The Pope, not like, it's like, oh my God, it's like, it's that whole like joke is like, is the Pope Catholic?
Yeah,
like someone will say something, like, oh, do you really like that? Is the Pope Catholic? And it's all of a sudden it's like we but this is perfectly what I really emphasize, is what I mean when I say postmodern. I don't mean postmodern in the sense of Derrida, Foucault, and the post-structuralist theorists.
You mean in the Jordan Peterson sense? Things I don't like.
I mean in a kind of I mean in a sense of a cultural death or confidence in a meta narrative that we can share, know, and come to appreciate together.
So this is an interesting point, though, as well, because in my view, right, I actually don't think you have to have confidence in a meta narrative to have confidence in a narrative. So from my view, like, of postmodernism, I'm like, I don't try to do in my hermeneutic, my epistemology, is sort of reach beyond my beliefs and justify things that I firmly believe by sort of like banging the table loudly, kind of being like, I mean objectively so, or metaphysically so, whatever. Instead, I'm like, no, it's me who believes these things, and when I'm arguing against people who disagree with me, it's me arguing against them. Like, it's my raft of beliefs, but that doesn't make it sort of like I believe those things any less, or they matter to me any less, or like in some sense, I'm unable to defend my values against competing values because I don't think they reach up into God's mind or something like that. I
guess like the way I worry about it is that it leads to a kind of incommensurability between individuals, where we can't even communicate and rationalize in a way that we can then bridge. And I mean, this is like the what I think in many ways is that you end up. And I think this is why the best thinker in this respect for this, and the characterization of the modern state, is probably Nietzsche, and this idea of the competing aesthetic ideals. So if we have competing aesthetic ideals, and this is a form of aesthetic judgments, which are essentially built from a kind of social currency, I think that when you enter that kind of, and I think Nietzsche almost sort of predicted this almost. I don't want to call it the commodification of social life, because I think the commodification in general, like that capitalism is mirroring the development of humanity, not necessarily driving the development of humanity. So I think that the ideology,
well, quite be both to some degree,
Oh yeah, 100%. No, like sort of, so it's like it's sort of reciprocity there, 100%. But I don't want to say it's like, in the same sense, like capitalism did it. It's all capitalism's fault.
Right.
Because I don't think that's what Nietzsche was saying. I think Nietzsche was saying that this is happening because of a kind of increasingly individualizing conception of reason and justification, such that authority is going to die. We've killed God. Nothing's going to replace it. And now we have like essentially this set of circumstances. And And I'm not saying that it's necessarily the death of God. I blame in many ways. Like you could be godless necessarily and share some sort of narrative, but I think that the issue is that there's no unity in terms of how to approach a conversation, such that there, or even reasons that you can give towards one another that would be applicable in cross um, political boundaries. To the point in which even when I think about the consequences of something, like, and this is what sort of McIntyre's point between liberals and libertarians, if you present a situation to a liberal with all of the same points of information, and then to a libertarian, they're going to come to radically different conclusions, and would like to think that the reason we're doing that is because we're just arguing from a sort of ideological basis, where he's actually saying it's like, no, we are thinking differently. Now that's fine necessarily. It's not to say like, we must all think the same, but in order to function in, like, how, I would go so far as to say to get truth or something, but in order to function together, to live in harmony, in order to prevent catastrophe, there has to be a level of social integration that we can kind of bridge this, what seems to be an ever widening gap between ideological poles. That's what really concerns me, I think, in today's society.
I agree with you there, in the sense that it's certainly in principle possible that people don't, share enough what I would call like hinge commitments or values or something like that, such that they're unable to proceed through, like discourse and dialogue. And if and if there's some kind of struggle between the different groups and values there, then they go to other means that I might think are less good. I do tend to think though that typically we're probably not at that point. I don't know if we're guaranteed to go to that point or something. And I think in general, as long as people are kind of socialized in the same culture and so forth, they share the same language, there's often going to be some hinges that can be appealed to, some common ground, in order to make a case through dialogue. It might just get harder and harder, like it's going to be very rare cases of complete cultural difference almost, where there's such little shared in terms of bits of language that are understood in the same way, or values that people were raised into and things, that they can't proceed. I do have a question though about then, given what you just said, the role that the kind of metaphysical objectivity of these values is supposed to play, because presumably, on your view, this has happened historically. Like people's value, like say, take the English Civil War or something as an example. People's values have differed that much that there's just no room for dialogue, and they have then just gone to war with each other rather than continuing to debate, right?
100%, yeah.
And then the question is, so if having if the existence, like in reality, of these metaphysical values is supposed to be playing this role of guaranteeing that people can't disagree that much, right? Then how is that possible? Because presumably, both kind of in that particular case, right, there were people on both sides who believed in not just they believed in the objective, but if it is in fact the case that there are these objective values too, then they're not
100%.
kind of how do you make sense of that on
Yeah, I mean, even amplify that even more, like the battle hymn of the Republic, my eyes have seen the coming. Yeah, that was sung by both sides of the American Civil War because they both believed that they were right. So like, you can see that in many ways, like it's not like a guarantee, like, okay, yeah, we all believe in God, now we're going to kill each other, like it's Catholics and Protestants, Jews and Muslims, Christians and Muslims, like, it's just a mess. History's a big bloody mess. The slaughter bench of history in many ways resolves many, and this is sort of Hegel, resolves many of these sort of ideological conflicts where you end up with a literal confliction in ideology, and the superior ideology wins because it's able to persist and survive in a kind of natural selection, right? Like, and that I think is there. I just don't want to rely on it as a epistemological tool.
Just to clarify, sorry, because was the claim there that it's actually the power struggle itself that's resolving these things, or somehow
once the power struggle is they sort of supplanted the ideological end is such that it reflects a development in history, which then conceptually characterizes then the next stages, in a way.
And
which
is that connected? And is that connected to the sort of like objective values in some way? And what is that way? I guess if
I mean, in many ways, it's connected to the lived experiences of individuals, what motivates individuals, why individuals like in a way which reflects why they would act, why they wouldn't act, what ways in which they would act, why that would be superior over the ideological opponent, that kind of thing. So like, why did the English develop the tank in World War One? What was it about the English sort of epistemology that led to the development of the tank versus the Germans? And that includes environmental factors, that includes sort of cultural factors, things like why is Alan Turing? Why are we getting an Alan Turing in England, but not necessarily in, let's say, Germany at the same time? And it might in many ways be towards the more liberal values, were at the time maybe more able to allow for an Alan Turing to come about, or be more willing to act, even if they then led to, he still got essentially persecuted in the end, and so on anyway, which is tragedy. So we can see that there is this sort of ideological component which I think like sort of battles out in history. I think that the what I'm really saying in terms of like there is this point. It's like not to say that like just believing in an objective truth resolves these things. What I'm really saying is that doing what philosophy teaches us is that what it should teach us is that we have a commitment to this sort of truth, that we have a commitment, but more so a commitment towards each other. That this truth is not something that I gain myself; it's something that we gain together, and that. So that when I try to reason, I see my dependence, my mutual dependence upon another, which should lead me to a kind of empathetic empathy, a radical kind of empathy towards another, such that like when you talk about your hinge commitments, like you sort of hinge, you sort of hinges in terms of your language, such that they can then provide the basis in the language game, and you say like, well, maybe we can appeal to these. Like what I really want is. And I think it's necessary at the basis in which when we think pre-linguistically, or when we think of how like a linguistic being was to form, a linguistic being had to form from a kind of behavioral analysis where they're able to understand the intentional states of another related to themselves and mutually engage.
I don't know if I believe that myself, by the way. Just to...
that's fine. No, that's fine.
Yeah.
So I would say that I would argue that, right, that language necessarily requires a kind of recognition of one's like in the same way that Wittgenstein would say, it's like the sort of slab, or and then relation to the form of life. And I think Hegel would kind of say it as a point of psychological recognition where I can understand the intentions and how it relates to me within a common domain. So like when we look at the way language, I think what language requires, language at the basis, like even at the point in which, let's say, there is no hinge commitments, we need to be able to bridge the gap between agents for not only language to function, because I think all language is interpretive and translative of in like maybe it's the internal states of agents, but that when we end up going above like specific agents but cross ideological bounds, that those bounds can be almost absolute, but a sufficiently developed ideology should recognize at the root of itself and of all other ideologies is a capacity for empathy and recognition. And that's the kind of philosophical virtues that I want to see perpetuated through society, such that, like you're a postmodernist, I'm not a postmodernist, but let's have a conversation about this. And maybe that we don't agree on everything, but at least we're able to then form the basis of the conversation.
Yeah. So I agree with that. Insofar as we sort of agree on certain values, it's obviously a good thing for this conversation and so forth. And because they're my values, I want people to share them. I think the maybe the issue is something like it seems to me like you're saying, and maybe you're not saying this, right? Something like either a belief in the objectivity of these values, or like some kind of heavy duty metaphysical concept, a belief in the heavy duty metaphysical values, right, in some way, is either leads to a propensity to people to act in a more peaceful or more truth concordant way or something, or that the in fact existence of these metaphysically heavy values somehow leads to a propensity to people to move in a particular kind of way. And I think moves people to act in accordance with them. And I think the point I was sort of trying to make was that it seems like actually neither the belief or the actual existence of this kind of metaphysical conception does that, because there's plenty of people. If it does actually exist, we still have the problem right now of the increasing polarization. It doesn't seem to be actually playing a role to heal those. And if that's a worry, and we also believe that it does play some sort of role, maybe we shouldn't actually be worried, right? Because the metaphysics will sort it out somehow. Or yeah, go ahead if there's something you want to say.
No, I was just going to say, it's kind of like, I do believe in both. Like, I think that there is like that the truth will resolve itself. The truth shall set you free and all that. And I think I was in a conversation with a guy the other day. I said, you can convince yourself as much as you want that what you're drinking is water, but if it's bleach, you're still going to die.
And as a pragmatist, I agree.
Very pragmatic, a kind of approach to it, right? So I mean, I would take from a pragmatic conception of truth. I think there is a necessary teleology there, right? I mean, you're probably not going to agree. I think there is a teleology there, such that there is a kind of a self-correcting mechanism of pragmatism. In the same way, like as natural selection, your peacock, you might look really sexy with your big tail and that, but you're gonna get fucking murdered if you look too good. In the same, so it's kind of like there is this sort of like, the peacock is not necessarily the best looking peacock. It's the one that's actually not going to get murdered by its predators. And that's going to mean a big tail, but not necessarily one which is going to stop it running away. So it's kind of like, okay, there's this sort of, maybe you could think of it as a, what would be the right word for it? A kind of, in the same way as sort of evolution is a kind of like cut-off points of what is actually applicable and not applicable ideologically. Like I think sort of like Freudian skepticism leads you to starve and kill yourself. Well, yeah, you're probably going to see the death of that ideology. So like there's going to be like a real pushback there. Success boundary conditions, if you will, of what ideologies are sustainable. What I really want to see is that as sort of epistemic agents or like agents who engage in epistemology, is that when I'm engaging ideologically, I don't like, there is the sort of natural set limits of me needs, which form the basis of many of me decisions in the world. But they're not really the only ones that I consider. Like I consider not only the needs of others, but I also consider the higher, let's say the higher desires and wants, psychological needs of others, and the value that other individuals have. And I think that yeah, sure, we could rely on history essentially self-correcting to the point in which eventually there'll only be those individuals left that are engaging within this sort of boundary. But I would much prefer to convince people, even for our own sake, that staying away from, it's like, maybe don't put the fork in the plug socket, don't, like, staying away from those boundary conditions is good for them. And that's what philosophy is about. It's sort of like recognizing the extremes, recognizing the dangers of those extremes, and bringing people back towards a well-mediated position.
So on my view, there's a lot that you've said that overlaps with my view actually there. So like I mean, I view truth as a word people use, but in terms of the sort of like what I think the right conditions to use that word are, is going to be something like we say certain sentences are true when we can basically rely on the use of those sentences in the way that we're trained to use them. So that you could say the content of those sentences, though I mean something different by content than like an actual representation, but you can rely on the content of those sentences to engage in an operationally coherent set of activities or something like that, right? So on my view, very much so the role of truth and sentences that we will and won't affirm is kind of attached to practices and what we're doing in the world. There are some sort of, because we're quite clever organisms and so on, there's some very complicated ways of using language we have where it can be very difficult to connect what's going on when we do that activity to any sort of like pragmatic success, or maybe the pragmatic success is considered to be like something more social, so it's that it's less tangible than like an experiment going a certain way, or like an engineering example, but it might be that we get something we want socially or something. But I think that part of what you're saying is going to be in line with my view. I guess the bit I kind of don't understand as well is why is the like teleology part of that required, or what like why do I need like something, what's lacking from the way I'm looking at it, and why do I need that lacking thing would be
I think that's exactly where we disagree. I think that's exactly like where the difference is going to come from, because I think what I'm saying is, in the sense that when you say truth is just a word and it relates to pure like sort of pragmatic relations, which is essentially how are we geared towards obtaining certain ends. This allows me, like if X allows me to obtain those ends, X is true. From as far as I can
it's
tell.
not exactly it's not like anything goes, right? Because in a sense there are constraints imposed by the world, so it's not so I mean, in a sense what you said is right, but I just don't want to give the misleading impression that it's just like whatever I say goes or something. But as long as I am able to actually like use that discourse or theory or words in a way that leads to pragmatic success, well then it's gonna
when you say there's constraints in like from the world, what does that mean? So like, because are those constraints for, like, ideologically speaking, from without? So like I could have an ideology, want certain things, then that constraint is applied upon me. And then if that's the case, is the pragmatic truth not directly in relation to that real constraint and that real sort of pragmatic good or bad? Or is it in relation to like the sort of ideology, an ideological conception?
So the words like reality, the world, and stuff are really kind of quite tricky here, right? Because what I mean, and this is the problem with why I think some people think you need a heavier duty, or like maybe a correspondence type view or something like that. Because what I think is when I'm saying world, right, I just mean all of my other beliefs and things. I don't really, I don't kind of get to bootstrap myself by using a special kind of word or something into the world as such. Instead, I mean all of my beliefs and dispositions to say certain things, and that's what I mean by that. By the world, and that.
But I'm just wondering, why isn't it everything goes then? Like, I mean, like,
because,
but
well,
you
because
say that there is this point of coherence.
So it's not just coherence, though. It's that it's the way that the coherence is operationalized in our activities. So as you said before, right, if I act on the basis of certain theories or certain discourses, what I'm going to do is like die, or I'll not, or maybe like rather than dying, there's like a shallower sort of type of not being successful, which is just like I'm hungry for a day, or I don't get food, or I'm in pain or something, and those sorts of things are what is going to kind of direct the direction that my model goes in over time in terms of building it up. But it's always connected to the activity in some way, not always death, right? But sometimes like bad and sometimes it's also pluralistic, right, in a different sense, because sometimes there's going to be competing or different ways of understanding things, both of which are actually pragmatically successful, say, at accounting for like experimental data in the sciences or something, but then actually the reason that one wins out over another is going to be more due to like social reasons or something. So it's still more successful for scientists to adopt one of those views over the other because they get something maybe like status or funding or prestige or the respect of their peers, and that's something they also want, right? That's like a type of success, but it's not. So it's complicated, basically, the relationship between activity, goals, and the construction of these languages. But I still think that that's kind of what's going on overall. I don't know if that helped to answer to clarify.
I think I think that makes. I think I understand. Let's say in the same sort of sense that, I mean, I guess the point that I would. I mean, I do disagree.
Sure.
In the sense that it sounds almost like a kind of phenomenalism, right? In the sense, like in a Wittgensteinian sense, where there is this sort of there is this kind of like there are these language games that are like not necessarily language games. I don't want to put too much of like Wittgenstein's philosophy, but there are these, let's say, these structures of beliefs and that you have internally, that sort of structure you. But then there are like sort of competing locus points of these, let's say, sort of maybe even practice orientated like structures within yourself that are all geared towards certain ends that you are mediating. That you also like, you might be the good of like being a well-renowned scientist or the good of getting a girlfriend or something. You know what I mean? And they might seem like worlds apart, right? Like, well, maybe if you, like, you know, whether it's like the girl I like, it doesn't care about science, or whether it's like the you know, like I don't have time for a relationship if I'm to be a good enough scientist to be well renowned or something, right? You know. And so you end up with these sort of competing value sets. And so when you're looking at like the coherent, the pragmatic coherentist approach, you're looking to sort of balance out judgments, like almost that you'll construct, that your role is to construct a relationship between all of these different competing structures in a kind of meta structure, if you will, that is like sort of self-imposed, where you say like, okay, science it is, or girlfriend it is, and this is why. And that is essentially the achievement of some sort of end goal, which you presuppose will lead to some sort of happiness or well-being or whatever it is. And I can kind of understand that, like, but it seems that there's also this point that you say the world itself has, you know, this impact upon me. Like, it's not something that you subjectively like. So when you reason, let's say, for example, you're getting some negative feedback. Let's say you could see it as, you know, you get people who, you know, it's the typical comedy sketch, isn't it? Where a guy gets slapped in the face by a girl or something, and he goes, "I think she likes me." You know, and like he convinces himself that, you know, in fact, the negative is the positive, and vice versa. You know, there is the point of going, how there seems to a point of, and I think that, and I imagine that you want to say there is no way out of that. If you genuinely do interpret it that way, there's no way to say that it is one way or it is the other.
What do you mean, like the world or things in the world or whatever?
Yeah, like how would you like say that? Like, so is it like for example?
I think I would say I think like I would say the world is one way. It's just that like then that's connected because of the connection to this like reflection about the world and further beliefs and things. You know, it's just very fallibilistic. I'd be like, well, like, you know, when I say the world is, so, you know, like I think the world is the way such that there's a table in front of me or something, or like some specific question. I've got views and beliefs about that. I wouldn't say like I don't believe the world is no way. But then if you ask me maybe certain types of questions about like maybe like metaphysical type questions, right, about whether certain entities exist or what correspondence like I'll answer differently to those things. I'll be like, well, I don't think that's quite right. I don't understand what correspondence would even mean, like correspondence between what and what. So I think it does kind of fit together there, but maybe
Yeah, I'm just sort of like, I guess I'm just sort of hung up on that, like in the sense of I'm not sure like when you say the world is imposing, then like so it is actually like an objective world.
Yeah, so this is part of this. I get that this is a difficult perspective, right? Because everything basically becomes public on this view, and the problem is that a further part of this view that might help is it's very it's quite skeptical of the role that things like represent. So ordinarily, right, I think most of philosophy is done from this perspective of internal representation of something, right, and this idea of, well, how do I make sense of the idea of like an internal representation as the primary thing, and the way that that then relates to other other things, and how do I build a theory from there. In terms of this view, like even using words like belief, for example, you wouldn't think of belief as like a thing that exists in some concrete sense, but instead belief is to be thought of as like a particular part of the discourse, right, where I can ask you for beliefs, you provide me with certain things, we're trying to use the word in a certain way, but in that kind of story there's only the public activity that we actually see of the language. There isn't there isn't like an entity called a belief that sort of doesn't exist spatially but we're related to somehow. And so that's one aspect of it. So then within so obviously like I'm still going to go on using the word beliefs, I just don't mean that by it. So when
like,
I say like,
would it be right to say like it's like a motivational or a more like a maybe a motivational relation to a motivational judgment, or like a motivational disposition or something like that, a specific kind of motivation.
I think
that
it's that's sort of right. But even when we try and go for interchangeable terms, right, we're going to run into the same problem, which is that like a word like motivation then is still to be understood in terms of like publicly what we see, basically, rather than appealing to now you could appeal to the causal role that maybe some kind of brain states play or something like that, right? And you could, but what you're not going to get out of this view is sort of appealing to like an essentially private metaphysical thing that plays like a causal role. Is
like I guess like I'm just like I mean I don't believe anything's private, like in a sort of, it depends on what we mean by that, though, you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
I guess
sure.
like
Or cause I say like maybe causally independent, maybe that would help from the physical world, maybe,
right.
Yeah.
I mean, even then, like I think like obviously there's like sort of metaphysical point, like the motto will come back, but like like what do we mean by causally independent? But I think that and how to understand causation, and but like it's sort of like if I was to just illustrate it in this respect, right? Like when you say, because you say that it's sort of like postmodern in one respect, and it's kind of a coherence between belief states, and those belief states are maybe relations between sort of lived experiences that are like that are almost deflationary. It's like the belief, there isn't a belief that's separate from the act of believing, maybe, and that like what you actually represent, it's almost like a psychological state that you sort of reflect in. And I mean, I don't necessarily, I think, agree with this sort of approach to
Sure. Yeah.
metaphysics, but at the same time, I think I understand where you're coming from. But then it's whether that this structure is something that's like we break it down, and when it hits bedrock, it's your psyche, or whether it hits bedrock and it's maybe not even just your psyche, but the psyche of everyone around you, or maybe it's it's intersubjective, maybe it's objective, maybe it's absolute in the Hegelian sense where it's subjective and objective. Like it's kind of like, if it's just subjective, then there's sort of it's a pie in the sky. Anything goes. Your psyche determines the sort of ways in which those success conditions that you're mentioning would essentially play out, right? And there is no way in order to sort of bridge that gap where it is a private existence in the way I would always say, almost solipsistic in some respect. And then there's the sort of intersubjective, like sort of aestheticisms, where like it's a balance between maybe the psyches of various individuals, and the pragmatic is sort of maybe this inner subjectivity is mediated through your subjectivity, but it contains the subjectivity of others at the same time. Um, but ultimately, it's this relationship between psychological states that were cohering, and so their psychological state has impact upon your psychological state, and then or there's like there is the world itself, like you know you have a psychological state, and then something hurts you, and your psyche isn't what structures that, it structures your psyche. um and so your psyche's moved to like it moves your beliefs around such that even from a coherentist perspective, like it could be like a kind of foundherentism, where there is like a foundation which your coherence is built upon, trying to match, and then it sort of asserts itself out of like a kind of like a sort of like a dark pond that you can't actually access, but makes itself known in your psyche. Like Lacan would say something like that. Or is it like, there is this there's this just fucking block of reality. There is this like and it's there, it's unavoidable at times, and it sort of hits you in the face. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like sort of where in the sort of spectrum, like, because that's I mean that I feel like characterize almost everything, everyone I can think of. Like
Yes, yeah. So I think to characterize the concern, right? It's something like, so given the things that you're saying, how do you make sense of the requirement to start with a subjective foundation? So is it something like that, or have I really misunderstood?
Somewhat. It's more of like, where's the ground of the pragmatic? Like
right.
where
yeah. So on that, I think that this is where the view really differs from these other, what I'm going to refer to as like representational or pictorial views of philosophy and metaphysics, regardless of how you come to understand, subjectivity and mental states and things. That the key disagreement is basically going to be that it's about whether or not they're essentially private. It's going to be that there's private experiences, right? Maybe they could be understood publicly. Who really knows or cares? It's irrelevant to the point I'm going to make. And that those representations in some way, then you either don't get to the world, you make sense of it through like idealistic metaphysics or something, or you do get to a world and you make sense of it by relating that to spatiotemporal reality. The view I'm taking actually kind of flips that all on its head, because language itself is a public activity, right? So on this view, you talk of beliefs and all that, you have to make appeal to social existence. You have to make appeal to public activity of making sounds, of gestures and things like that. And so it's in the world, it's in ordinary life already, rather than it kind of making appeal to sort of like the private landscape almost of one's subjectivity, and then figuring out, well, where do I go from here? Instead, the appeal is initially to language as it's encountered as public activity that's learned and socially built by people and things, and then that's the basis is like spatio-temporal stuff happening, rather than relating like objects and things to and then like, how do I make sense of that from the point of view of epistemology? Well, are there foundations to that? Are there instead no, someone needs to learn what words like belief even mean from their community before they get to a point of having like conversations about models of beliefs and things.
So if I was to ask you what came first, the belief in the community and the word, or the mental act, what mental act might be a lot, you mightn't like that. I don't know whether you like that, because you get like the sort of act, if you, it doesn't have to be mental, but there's the act,
sure.
what sort of came first there? So like, because it's like, because there's a part of us that's like, is this existentialism? Is this a kind of existentialism where it's like, what you're saying is like almost like there is this public structure which is actually already presupposes a sort of private structure, which makes that public structure exist, but can never actually be one with this private structure, such that this gives meaning to that, that does not give meaning to this.
So I'm not sure I'm 100% clear on the question, right? But maybe, because there's a sense in which I can understand the question. I don't think it's what you're asking, though, which is kind of like, well, chronologically, what happens to the person on this view or something? And I'm like, well, it's not that they, so the reason, for example, like at the start of philosophical investigation, when Wittgenstein has that quote from Augustine, which is like, there were kind of some objects privately, and then I turned towards them and learnt the labels off my parents, whatever. It's because that's the view that's being resisted there. And the idea is going to be more that it's not that there are beliefs, because to believe in the sense we know it is this linguistic practice that we're trained in. We were trained to use the word, right? Instead, there's a person, and society and the culture that they're in, and their parents and people that like impose themselves on that person. Now, there are specific questions we can ask about the nature of how that happens that are maybe, they're questions specifically for like psychology and things, really, about, well, what's the nature of the mechanisms involved here, or what is the exact ordering of things. But broadly, like, that's the picture here. It's not that there's like a baby thinking like, this is weird, I'm in the world now. And then, the parents start giving the correspondences to nouns in English or something to their thoughts. It's instead that there's just a being, like, sure, like I could agree they're having an experience or something, but it's not like it's not a linguistic experience, whatever it is,
So I mean, like that. I mean, so this is the thing. I think that if it's the same sort of thing as Wittgenstein, in the sense that it's the form of life would probably be it is the actual just being, that language is that is the language, is the form of life that you're engaging in, such that the form of life forms the basis and the meaning of the words. Does that sound about right? So the belief is formed
it's about right. I think it's far too Hegelian an interpretation of Wittgenstein. Just it is right, but I wouldn't want to think that. I just wouldn't want to assume that form of life here is like a heavier thing than just ordinary life, than just ordinary existing.
I mean, like, I think that it's just I think it seems that from Wittgenstein's perspective, if I understand it, it's sort of self and other relation, such that it's it seems that he wants to say that there is this, but I remember the kind of thing is that he wants to say there is almost this rejection of the private, though, right? In the sense, like the people in the box, right? Like there is
rejection of private
language.
Of private language, but also with that, a rejection of propositions or pictorial representation with respect to language too. So it's not a rejection that I would tick a checkbox on a form that says you're thinking stuff or you're experiencing stuff or something like that. But it's the attempt to create a model that relies on a particular kind of non-natural thing that's somehow in the mind, that's representational and relates to the thing. That's definitely a part of it, because instead language is this public activity that's
he wants to say it to the point in which when you say like ow for pain, it is the pain. Like it is like,
well, this is a very complicated point. So it's not that it stands for the pain, right? So Wittgenstein makes the point that it's like, I am in pain. It's not like, here's the pain, there's the ow or something, and I like relate the two. It's instead the correct use for like pain language is like, I am in pain, and not like I'm stood in, to adopt more contemporary philosophy, like in the Cartesian theatre, looking at the pain over there as a quail, and the
and I mean, like, I'm very sympathetic to that in many ways. Like, I think Wittgenstein's actually a genius. I think that of all the people that you could actually agree with, like, I think if I wasn't a Hegelian, I'd probably be a Wittgensteinian. Like, I think that my issue is that, do you know Robert Brandam's sort of
I'm not sure. No.
arguments. So Robert Brandom sort of argues against the Wittgensteinian perspective in terms of, and he worries what his argument is the kind of risk of semantic nihilism. My Wittgensteinian friend,
Definitely. That's the whole point, is semantic nihilism.
Well, my Wittgensteinian friend is to say that, like, it's not he's wrong, he's misinterpreting Wittgenstein, right? So I've got a Wittgenstein.
I'd have to see what he says exactly, but insofar as semantics are understood as representational, I definitely think that's the correct interpretation of late Wittgenstein.
But in the sense of there being a kind of so like in a kind of like where I would say there is a fittingness to the concept, right?
Concept here is off the table really for Wittgenstein.
Oh, you see, I don't think so, man, because like you've got Geach though, man. You've got Geach. So I'm not even an analytic. I'll stand this, right? But you've got Geach's interpretation of Wittgenstein and his build on Wittgenstein, where he starts saying that these are mental acts, and so like an idea is just a mental act communicated through language. And that what the form of life is just is the mutual mental acts of various individuals, which aren't necessarily one with the signifiers. Like aren't like a separation of like, this is the thing that I'm signifying. It is the sort of use itself that's been built up. So you do kind of have like interpretations of Wittgenstein that lend themselves to the point in which he goes, you know, like
I think those interpretations of Wittgenstein will struggle to make sense of, you know, like there are a lot of kind of jokes that Wittgenstein makes about it. So, you know, he says, for example, you know, hear the thought, they're the words, you know, hear the cow and the money you can buy, they're the money and the cow you can buy. That like he's making sort of like weird jokes about that point of view. I think the way I interpret that is because it isn't his point of view, and he's kind of like, you know, he's said some stuff moving away from that view, and then he's just, you know, writing an aphorism that's a sort of like jest about. So I'd say that those are not going to be the right. I
mean, I would say that in terms of like affirming something that's similar to his like Tractatus, 100%. I think the Philosophical Investigations is a refutation of the Tractatus and that approach of a kind of corpuscular model representing reality and the kind of like you know, the like language is the limit of my world, and what I have is a world of facts, or like like in this sort of thing. But at the same time, language is the limit of his world in this respect. But language is something that language is the world. That is like it is the living in the world almost.
Right? I think it would be better to think of it as thought, though, in that early philosophy, because thought is conceived of as a logical representational system, right? And this is and that obviously has its sort of antecedents in the sort of way that Russell's thinking about, well, we take ordinary language and now I've got a more precise way of describing it, and you know, this logic that I've created, and I can connect that to an epistemology around sense data or whatever, and maybe you reject that, but the point is that the private mental space consists of logical thought as representational of the world. And so the job of the metaphysician then is to kind of understand the relation of these propositions and how they fit in the world and things like that. And I think that is the whole thing that Wittgenstein is sort of undermining, right? And I would broadly say that actually is going to be a refutation of all of these representationalist views. So even through to, you know, like Aristotle making distinctions between the sign, you know, the sign that's used and the movement in the soul, right? Or Platonic conceptions of ideas, and all representational views of philosophy. I think that late Wittgenstein would be disagreeing with there, but without, you know, he's not a behaviorist, but it's a rejection of the reliance on a particular type of metaphor as he would see it. From obviously, you know, people who genuinely believe those things don't think that they're using a metaphorical type of language to create a model or something. But I think that is the.
But would you not? Do you not think there is so like? There's a point in which there is the way in which we can understand language. There is this. There is a correct and an incorrect way in which we can use language for Wittgenstein, right? Like,
yes, but what we can't mean by that is like we can't mean sort of the way God prefers, or the way nature imposes, or something like that. Instead, correctness is construed by the linguistic community, right? So it's what you're trained into. So for example, if I start using the word true to refer to like brick walls or something, it's not going to go, because that's not the role that word has in the linguistic practice we're trained into. And I don't just mean here keeping the concept fixed and switching out the noise or something. It's just it's inimical to the way that we're trained. It doesn't fit with.
But it's a coherent logical relation in terms of whether it actually fits in the grammar, right?
Well, like I would resist the idea of it being logically coherent, because rather, I think from Wittgenstein's point of view, there isn't a precedence of logic. Rather, logic is a type of linguistic activity people can be trained into. So you can be taught to
language is reason. Like that's what he was like. Reason is language.
Reason's another word, sort of thing. So reason isn't like one thing, and then we've discovered correct languages we can apply on top of reason. Rather, reason itself is a type of way of talking that we've come up with, right? Where there are bounds of the appropriate ways of applying words and inappropriate ways and methods that we might use and things.
I mean, obviously it has to be necessarily, right? But like, it's sort of like it seems to me that there has to be, like, even for the point of like language to develop and for like I don't think so. I don't know how Wittgenstein would, because Wittgenstein and like there's the whole like how does Wittgenstein approach things like animals and animality in terms of like there's the whole, if a lion could speak, what could it, what would it say? And there's Wittgensteinians who will go so far as to say, I mean, I'm a vegan, right? So I argue against the Wittgensteinians in this respect. So the Wittgensteinians that'll say, language, like lions, because they don't have language, don't necessarily have an identity. They don't have a sense of self, because it's an internalized structure that you gain from essentially a public activity. And then you'll get the Wittgensteinians that'll say, well, there is perhaps in some sort of like a sort of primordial sense, there is a sort of, not a self, but there is a sort of a sort of motivated actor there or something like that, but it lacks the conditions in order for you to say that it's a continued identity through time, that kind of thing, like a psychological continuity, because that's essentially trained into you as well. And then then you could say that actually no, this isn't, like, the identity is not trained into me, my recognition of the identity is trained into me, and it's a sort of reflectivity, which I don't think is necessarily the Wittgensteinian position, but I think I've kind of heard people say. So it's like, I'm just wondering, like, because depending on how you respond to this, like, there's a point in which whether there is a world, right? Like when we're talking about something being trained in or not, or it's like, is there a world before we speak?
Well, I would say yes to that.
Okay. Right.
I would say yes to that, but by using the word world, right, I haven't got outside of my beliefs somehow.
No, I don't think that's right. Yeah. Like that's okay, that's fine. But that, I think, so then you can talk about something being like a real, like, so something can be like, this is where like someone like do you know like Lacan at all? Like Zizek and Lacan, yeah. Like Zizek, when he talks about like the trauma of the real, the traumatic experience of the real, right? Where it's not, it's precisely the point in which you cannot speak that it makes itself apparent. So there is this, if like, when he talks about the sublime objective ideology, it's the way in which that structures your, like, maybe structures the language, the object which structures the language. But in terms of like trauma for like a Lacanian in this respect, when we're talking about the real's that in terms of resisting meaning. So it's like there is the language that I'm speaking, and then there is the real. But the real and the language aren't like this. It's not like the Kantian noumena where there is this like where it, depending on how you interpret it, where there is this sort of unknowable reality. It's like I can know it through the represented, but the way in which I know it is its lack of representation. And that's a traumatic response that, like, so for example, if I am having, let's say I believe like, oh, this is water, this is water, this is water, and I drink the bleach, there's a point in which like the trauma of the real could be this isn't water, right? Because of the coherence between the beliefs that I had prior and its relation to water. You could think of it as the grammar, and then my engagement with it. There is a feedback there, which leads to an incoherence within my worldview, or like my worldview maybe gives
Yeah,
like
yeah.
but like within that sort of position that I've held,
Yeah.
which gives me a direct feedback, which I would say indicates whether there is a semantic, whether there is a fittingness to the concept, which implies that it can't be a semantically nihilistic point where there is this is just there is no world outside of this. There is a world outside of this. Well, outside of this, there is a world.
Yeah, what?
I'm trying to gain knowledge of it.
Yeah.
And it's neither outside nor inside, almost like that. But it certainly structures and mediates what is possible in this respect. And is that like, would you say that's kind of where you are? Like, there is a real pragmatism there, like that kind of
Yeah, for
exerts
sure.
itself?
For sure, it's like that. I think there's a part of this that is going to be the difficult part, which is rather than it being the idea, like I use, for example, the idea of like the content of which can be relied upon. But I think the problem is I have to use language. People are so comfortable with with these alternative views, like pictorial type representational views, that you almost sometimes, to get people just to see things, have to appeal to some of that stuff. But there's a way of making sense of that actually inside the view that's going to be a little bit different. So so when I say people rely on the content of which, well, content there's like shorthand for, say, a whole discourse of using language in certain ways. So like words that have been constructed by people and are used in certain conditions and so forth, right? And the idea is that you use the language in the right sort of way, that then relying upon that discourse doesn't lead to your actions being kind of like disharmonious with your expectations or something like that, right? And so I think that there is a sense of agreement with what you're saying in the sense of, if I kind of have a theory about something and I try and act on its basis, and that the theory says that I should be refreshed by this glass that I'm drinking, and instead I start coughing up blood or something, and so clearly something's gone very wrong, and that discourse isn't working for me in the right sort of way, and so there's some activity of belief revision or something to engage in as a result of that. I think in terms of making a heavier duty kind of general claim about reality, as the real is, I forget exactly how you phrased it, something like the thing that can push back and cause trauma or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, like, you could even just see it as the sort of the ground of the like this is
The
where I would
ground
say
of the
like,
yeah.
so like
Yeah,
a
the ground
fitting.
of the pragmatic would maybe be a bit more all right, I guess. I wouldn't want to build the idea of trauma into it or something, just
Yeah, it
because.
doesn't have to. I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah,
giving
yeah.
that as an example more than anything. It's just, I guess and I think this is one of the reasons I brought up animals. So, for example, do you believe that animals can have beliefs?
I mean, I'm sort of is my answer. I think because my sort of conception of belief is being able to use a word in a sort of way, right? Well, I don't think they can have beliefs in the same sense that we can. But belief, I don't use belief just to mean people who speak English and say the word belief as well, right?
Yeah.
I use belief also in, I look at the actions and activities that people take when they use the word belief, and I sort of say, well, I'm going to call that belief too. And people who speak Chinese who don't have the word belief, do that sort of thing. And I'm probably going to do it for a dog or something as well. It doesn't mean that I think that there's like then a metaphysical essence shared between all those cases that sits behind it or something. It's just that I think the appropriate way of using the word belief is to encapsulate such activities, and yeah, I'm fine using that for animals.
Why do you think that's appropriate?
I'm not exactly sure. I think it's probably because it could be because I think it's helpful to make sense of the what I take to be intelligence that's being exhibited. Maybe it's also because using words like belief is in concordance with kind of granting certain type of status in terms of value, and then I think it's important to attribute that at that point so that we will value the status of animals in a maybe not in exactly the same kind of way as persons, but at least in a different way to, concrete or something.
No,
like,
no, I think that you kind of summed it up very well when you said like helpful, like it's helpful. Does that seem about right? Like where it's like
it's helpful for things I'm trying to do there, which is, like I see that thing and I'm like, I want to give it a certain kind of status, but I can consider like different activities I might be trying to do. Like maybe I'm trying to oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's whether like, so for example, like, and I guess this is what I'm trying to work out, is it helpful in relation to the thing that you're trying to do, or is the thing that you're trying to do governed by something which defines what is helpful and not helpful, right? Like, so for example, like I might think it's helpful to knock a nail through my arm, and then I decide that's actually really not very helpful, like, and so like there is this, like, I think that there's a point in which, and I think that maybe I mean I don't agree with Wittgenstein, right? So in terms of how he approaches language, I think I agree with like Heidegger, and I think it's a tool, and I think it's a tool which structures you, and I think it's a tool which forms you such that it actually, you reform yourself in language. But there is something not necessarily underneath language, but the language itself is one with the thing which was there prior. And
I think there's a way of formulating these as so I guess on the first point, like, Wittgenstein is very heavy on using tool metaphors for language, so I wouldn't want to resist that point from internally from within a Wittgensteinian point of view. But I think there are ways of maybe formulating what you're expressing as questions for the Wittgensteinian theory that wouldn't, that like actually there'd probably be a lot of points of agreement, right? So is there anything beyond language? Yes, right? Or is there something to being human that isn't just
when you say yes, I do not think my Wittgensteinian friend. I'm gonna ask him. I'll be like, I just got told that Wittgenstein. Like, would you say that Wittgenstein, like because like if you think so, and that's cool because like
early Wittgenstein would answer no, but late Wittgenstein would, and the early Wittgenstein, the limits of my thought, the limits of my language, right, and so forth. So everything is kind of like it's a kind of, you could say, I wouldn't want to call it linguistic solipsism, because you want to draw the contrast between the early and late theories in terms of like the emphasis on language versus on propositions, but I'd maybe call it a sort of like propositional thought solipsism or something like that, right?
Yeah, like the sort of collection of facts and like
yeah.
I really don't like the Tractatus. I think it's obviously it's a good piece of work. I don't like it. I really hate it. Like, I think J. Moore said like it's a great PhD, except that everything's like so like
there's some interesting stuff in there, but I tend not to agree with the view overall in there.
Yeah, and I think like he developed a lot like when he hit but like I guess the point is so I wouldn't have characterized Wittgenstein in the philosophical investigations as believing something external to language, because doesn't he use the metaphor of like trying to zoom out, where like when you try and zoom out and you try and talk about something like this, that you just end up essentially like that it's like that you're just adding another layer, like you're not actually like seeing
when you try and talk about it in language, that's the problem is, so this would be the observation or something would be something like, the only time we're the only time we're talking about it is in words, is in language, right? We never talk about it outside of language. There's a sense in which analyzing that is just kind of trivially tautological, but I guess the sense in which it's profound is that you realize that I think there's a mistake people make where they appeal to words like reality or world or something as if they've somehow stepped outside of language, but they're still just using they're using a word and by that word they just mean a bunch of more stuff that they're saying. But then if you ask, is there stuff other than language or something, like there's ways of asking questions which will, get an affirmative yes. It's just, is there a way of talking about them outside of language? Well, it's almost tautologically true that you can't talk about something outside of a language. Like,
yeah. I guess like in order for it to be like, because he's quite anti-metaphysician, right? Like Wittgenstein, and he wants to say that this is like, it's all problems of language. But he admires the metaphysicians. Like, he's not like that much of an arse. Like, he does actually think that they're some of the best thinkers. He just thinks that they're all wrong. Like, the typical Wittgensteinian, like,
well, I think he was very. My view is that he was actually very upset with metaphysicians. Like, I think he had respect for certain thinkers in philosophical tradition, but in general, many of his peers who are doing kind of like full-time philosophy and so forth, I think he almost views them as standing in the way of resolving real problems, of often being very selfishly engrossed in a type of activity that wasn't helpful to people. And there's going to be maybe some sympathy with your view of philosophy there, of the academicians as being kind of out of
touch
in some way. Yeah. And I think I think that the criticism kind of comes in that it's like, there's an obsession with theory and model, whereas really what we should be doing is putting that aside and focusing on these actually well-defined practical questions where, maybe we can use our skills that we've developed linguistically here to make some progress in something like psychology or medicine or something, and actually help people in reality.
It's funny you say psychology. I think one of the fields that's one of the worst for this is actually psychology.
Okay.
I think it, like in the same way, like Lacan, like one of the things like Lacan like points out is he's kind of this sort of resistance to the psychology of the time, right? Where it's like very top down, like, I'm the doctor, I'll tell you what's wrong with you, this kind of thing.
I think that's almost kind of a little bit like maybe where Wittgenstein would kind of agree, right? Because I think he thinks that there are a lot of the problem that the philosopher has of kind of like a reification of lots of terms, a craving for like general theory by borrowing like like taking an ordinary term we're familiar with and then searching for like a general essence of it. I think that Wittgenstein's characterization of what's going on in psychology is a similar sort of thing, right? So you've got people's reports where they're using ordinary language for like emotional states and things, and then as people construct psychology, they're trying to construct like general theories of the terms that people are using, and so they're kind of essentializing them and reifying them in certain ways. And maybe we'd say, well, what the philosopher can do here is more carefully look at the way that these words are actually used to maybe avoid creating like rigid and unhelpful like definitions of things that might get in the way of really helping people with the problems that they have.
I mean, I would agree with that, but I think that there's like I think there's the like, so I mean, I don't think there's a problem with essences, right? But that's like there's like the I think that, so I think language is necessarily a construct of universals. I think probably agree with that in the sense that language isn't the same thing as the form of life, and so when we extrapolate on the language, we're extrapolating upon almost an extrapolation, right? Like, and so the in that way I would agree. I think that the Wittgensteinian, like, I think that for the Wittgensteinian to say that there isn't like an actual truth or a sort of like,
well, it depends what you mean. So here's the problem with this, right? It's does the Wittgensteinian believe there's truth? Yes. But when you say, well, the Wittgensteinian doesn't believe in my theory of truth, so they're wrong. Well, it's like, well, obviously you think
not a specific theory. No, I mean, like, not a specific theory in the sense that, like, so for example,
well, by actual, because you said actual truth, right? And I take you by actual to just mean kind of, well, not just to mean your theory. And it's like, well, yeah, because they disagree with your theory.
I don't mean my specific theory. No, I don't. I mean, like, in the sense that, like, it's not just the. So, for example, in the Wittgensteinian sense of it, so in the sense that, like, there is this sort of grammatical structure. Like, if it's contained only within the language, right, then I would call that almost not. I don't want to call it virtual, right, but we'll call it virtue. If we say truth is this thing that represents relations between words in a language, which themselves might comport to structures that actually exist, actually exist, because like, even like saying that itself, like, are these forms of life, but they're not actually structured as them, like these forms of life themselves. Like the way that I would argue is that, like this is where I would push back on the kind of Wittgensteinian, where language is something that we are structured in, and I would say that language,
I think that's the view.
recipe.
I think that is the view, by the way. Like, I really do think it's that the view is that it's something we're structured in, like that, and that's the sense in which, because it's viewed as a public activity on this view, it really entrenches personhood in order, like just the ordinary conception of social normal life, rather than like a grander vision of people as, like, well, the rationality of the like internal and things like that. It's just in all, it's in, yeah.
See, this is where like the sort of German idealist, sort of even American pragmatist in us is going to come out, right? Where I'm going to say, like, yeah, there is this real pragmatism. It's real. It structures the language, like, and the form of life. So the form of life, yeah, the form language is a reflection of a form of life. I completely agree, like 100%. That form of life is structured from a real pragmatic relation to myself, others, in the world around me, which is governed by almost a law-like construction, which I can then represent, or rather is represented in the form of life, or sort of structures the form of life, which leads to this sort of
we come up with laws and things about it, and those laws help us to do stuff into the future with it, and yeah.
But more than that, there is this. It's not like I can, like, so for example, like if we all agree something's good, in relation to it, let's say the language we internalize this. I'd say there's a point in which the language itself can have there's a moment in which, and this is like maybe when I bring back like this sort of idea of Lacanian trauma, and even this idea of like why animals need to have, I think animals necessarily have belief system, like beliefs. And I think that in order to explain their behaviors, when we look at their behaviors, in order to account for how an animal behaves in a certain way, they have belief states. And I'm borrowing this really from McIntyre. And that's not this, and this is why I would say, like, and this is why I'm borrowing this from McIntyre as well. I'd say an animals often should be understood as, rather than non-linguistic, as pre-linguistic, which means that they kind of have the behavioral prerequisites necessary for the construction of a form of life and language that, let's say, like Wittgenstein's going to like sort of reflect on, and that the complexity of this is where Hegel's going to use something like the idea of mutual recognition, like psychological recognition, but just the complexity of the communicable structure is the language, such that the more developed, the more language-like it is going to happen. It's not going to be like this hard cutoff in which this is a language, this isn't a language. We're going to see degrees of sort of linguistic behavior, if you will, or let's say like degree or like complexities of forms of life, which are going to lead to having more or less complex belief states and as such. But not until the point of like, and I think this is where like a language, as we would normally like sort of like where we would not until the point in which we get to maybe a written medium or something, or more complex sort of verbal medium, that we hit a point in which we can start talking about language in a very sort of objective, intersubjective way, which is held constant by a kind of shared zeitgeist, right? And at that point, it's like, yes, that, I mean, like, and I think that it is just again, it's the form of life, but there is a point at which it's being held constant, which is the communicable structure. I think language, animals have that too. And I think that one of the things that gives an explanation as to not only why we are developing it, why animals develop it, but why it's even useful to us, is that there is something that it's useful in order to achieve, and that thing I would argue that experience, if you will, is the same thing as truth. And that's where I'm going to say something like, it's like beauty and truth are the same thing. So Gadamer is going to say that, for example, the scientific conception of truth is the same thing, is dependent upon an artistic conception of truth as beauty. And so it's a moment which it's not just like a kind of like, oh, this is truth, I have it. It's that thing that my proposition corresponds to, like it is a moment which defines my life, my living, right? In a way that makes it meaningful. And so like it's in a very pragmatic sense as well. Like, so that you have this unity of this pragmatism where, and I know you probably don't agree with any of this, right? Like, but like, you have this unity of this this pragmatism where there is this real pragmatism. You have this point of language and this idea that, it's not as if you can think in a way which sort of goes against the sort of form of life and this communicable structure. But what you also have is an explanation of a reality outside of that structure, which is making that structure what it is, and giving the boundary conditions of what make that structure possible or not. In the same way as when we're talking about ideologies before, some ideologies will become untenable, some ideologies won't. And then once that there is the point, and this is what I think philosophers can do, is we can, there's in two senses. In the first is in the public sense of just encouraging the virtues, which I would say this is philosophy, like that shared structure that we have, that communicable structure, that is the philosophy, such that if we promote certain virtues, we will enhance our likelihood of essentially survival and positive outcomes. And then the second point is to recognize what those virtues are and why, through a point of reflection, and that reflection can be useful. Not that it should replace, like, in the kind of perverse sense, like the sort of thing. And I think that Wittgenstein's very right to be sort of disgruntled with a lot of metaphysicians, but that metaphysics does have its place. Obviously I'm going to say that because I'm a Hegelian, so I am metaphysics gang. But so what would you sort of say against that? Like, what was?
I mean, which part? There's a lot.
There's a lot. Mostly
the first part about the end bit. Yeah.
No, mostly the start, like in terms of language, animals, the way in which we can.
I think the way of understanding, this part is that a word like belief isn't to be viewed as, a noun that stands for a special, like a particular essential thing, right? A thing with clear-cut boundaries. It's a word that we use in certain conditions, and like word and use can be sort of polysemous, so that like we use words that, so think of the word light, for example, right? We say the light of reason, light frigates, light tank, turn in the light in the hallway or something. And there's sort of a sense in which they're all metaphorically related to each other, which is, that there's something in common there-ish between each kind of instance, but there's not like one essential thing, like the light of reason, it's metaphorically illuminating, right? It's not illuminating in the sense that but we're kind of deploying the connotations and things, and in order to make sense of that use in a different case. Now, the use of belief, it doesn't have to be as different exactly as between light of reason and the light, but I want to say that rather than, and this is even going to stand between individual people, rather than when I attribute beliefs to people, me thinking they all have, there's some truth maker to that's the same in every case, like either a metaphysical proposition they're related to in some kind of way where they have justification and it's true and they believe it. So they like, instead I'm gonna just kind of say, there's uses for the word, right? Like when someone reports to me that they believe that, if they say I believe something, well then I'm gonna go, yes, they have beliefs. Or if they say certain kind of statements, I'll say they have beliefs. If they exhibit behavior that seems to me like it's intelligent in a certain kind of way, or it's goal directed, or it's of a certain complexity, I'm gonna sort of say beliefs, then I think but I don't think what there's going to be is like a general theory of belief that is like a conceptual analysis of the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be belief. Instead, there's going to be this kind of cluster of related overlapping concepts to some degree, and some fuzzy boundary around that where you stop saying, like, maybe if there were a bunch of leaves blowing in this is a typical sort of thing a philosopher will do, say, well, you've given me your theory of belief, so if some leaves were blowing in the wind in a way that seemed to be intelligent to you, would you then say it had beliefs or something? Well, I'll be like, well, no, because there's I sort of only seem to say it of things that I already agree are living organisms in some way, or but that doesn't mean that that's a necessary condition. Maybe I also extend my use of belief to like a collective that doesn't have any particular, like I'd say, the beliefs of Germans or something. And that's the way this view of language is very like, it's not that anything goes, but language becomes less about rigid concepts and a little bit more fuzzy, right? So it's entirely appropriate to say, like, think some animals have
function
beliefs
over form in many ways, right? Like,
yeah, if you want to make it more theoretical, like kind of a type of functionalism is going to maybe get there, but it's just being resistant still to the kind of like, well, it's either this function, that function, or that, and those are the boundaries of what it means, right? Because instead, language is more loose.
Point in which is going to be like, you're going to have to say it's this
function,
not that function, right?
So in any particular case, yeah. So you can give a complete description of all of the actual cases that I will say are beliefs and that I will say aren't beliefs, right? That's gonna. Maybe it could be infinite in principle because you could vary some random thing so much, but I think it's probably going to be like a finite set of uses. But then, because language is, but part of the realization of adopting this theory, right, is to look at language less mechanistically as like a theory driven by rigid concepts or something, but more organically as this public activity, and go, well, yeah, by the way language is, it actually adapts to the situation over time, and we come up with new uses depending on context. So that's why like Wittgenstein uses metaphors like of a city with like a medieval district with older streets, and then there's parts of it that are kind of like more built up and maybe a financial district. And it's actually, to understand language, it's like a historical artifact, right, with all of these different parts to it, and it's living. It's not just it's not a mechanical rigid theory or something.
I mean, I can certainly sympathize with that. Like, and I think it's really interesting.
The overlap, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. There is, like, I think there's a lot. I think that I guess the point I can't get it myself around in the sense is that there's this point in which, like, there's this kind of function and use determines the meanings of words, such that the various meanings are defined by its use, and the signifier itself is essentially just essentially not a representation, but a relation between a use and a sort of way in which we represent that use to others. So like it, like, and that's why his whole thing of tools in a toolbox, don't, you can confuse them, but they're actually specific kinds of action and function and uses, right? Like, and I get that, but it comes to a point where you're going to have to say that there is a separation between function A and function B, such that there is use A and use B in terms of achieving specific states of being, which that are going to imply almost a formal account, where it's like, this is now an actual entity with a specific identity that we are that is defined, right?
I agree. Like, you can give a characterization of the way a word is used appropriately in a particular context or something. The reason that then justifying that particular way as like the natural or correct way, objectively from a God's eye point of view or something, isn't going to work is just because of the historical change of language over time, right? There's all sorts of words that now mean completely the opposite thing that they did 500 years ago, or they didn't exist, or that and the use drifts and changes over time. So we won't be able to kind of reach up into the eternal on this, but at any particular time you can kind of give a characterization of words and draw some approximate boundaries around
I
things.
mean, like, you don't have to reach into the eternal in one respect, but at least into the natural, right? There has to be some sort of like relation to like towards a real pragmatic end, right? That is kind of like actually defining why we believe this is useful, right? Such that like my life is structured that
But this is very unmysterious, though. I think. I think that this is so. For example, suppose there's some. Try and think of a good example of a word that words that are contentious at the minute. There's a lot of debate around the correct definition of woman, right? Or there's a lot of debate about maybe like how to use a word like troll or something. And there are different like when you imagine particular cases. So say there's somewhat, you're talking to a 50-year-old and they're like, troll, what do you mean, or something? Well, you can say, well, you just paint a specific picture, right? You say, well, imagine, someone's in a comment feed and they're just kind of saying a bunch of stuff that they don't really mean to get engagement. Well, then they're trolling. And then, and you give them some cases and then maybe they repeat something back to you. And just as far as, just as far as they use that word now in what you deem to be the appropriate sort of way, you take it that they've understood it. But what you never really do is consult that they got like a proposition. You don't like see into their mind. You don't, and because that's the way that language works, it means that even in complicated cases, there might be linguistic disagreement. Like, and that's where you come onto like a case like woman, for example, where clearly. Okay, go ahead. Yeah,
I still think that it no, it's right. I still think that implies a kind of like meeting of the minds in terms of
practice
sharing. I'm gonna cyber geek, right? I'm gonna 100% and say it's mental act, right? Like, so
no, it's practice, because I might have nothing in my right. How you might appeal publicly linguistically to mental act, right? You say the word mental act, and that's the public part, but you never don't like, how are you in contact with my experience? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not you.
You can act is probably just as good in many ways, right? Like,
but this is the thing, right? You can only like right now in this conversation when we disagree, you can only appeal to the words I'm saying, the gestures I'm making that you see. But what you never do is you go, look, you said that, but I saw in your soul that it was different, kind of thing, like.
Well, when I mean your soul, I mean like I would say that in terms of how I attribute like a soul or a psyche in this respect is by a recognition of those intentional states, such that I can see that you are acting towards a given end, which implies an internal state from the externality that I'm perceiving, such that I say that there is an internality there that gives me an indication that you are separate from me and you're also not inert like a rock. Like, and so like there is the animality like that. I would be like, all right, that's animated. It seems to be intentional, directed, it's self-governing, that kind of thing, right? Like, and I think I can indicate that from like sort of behavioral analysis, and I think that, and I guess my point is to say that is the bedrock of language, such that the language doesn't make the subject. Like, the subject isn't structured by the subject is structured by the language in a kind of reciprocity, right? But that there's a kind of real structure which makes language form. Then there is and that is a real and that implies, I think, that there is a real fittingness to not necessarily the uses of certain words, but rather like you could think of it as ways of living. And this is why I sort of brought up the sort of Gadamer's point of the autistic truth, like. If there's a way of living, if there's a way of being, which is truth, and it's not like, have I represented this correctly? Right? I do hate that myself. Like, I want to, like, I'm very much more close to, as a Hegelian, like I would say founderantism, so coherence, founderantism, but not just sort of very much objective correspondence. Like, oh, look, I saw it, it's there. Like, and in that respect, I'm sympathetic to this approach, because it seems to be there is this, in the sense of this form of life, there is this sort of this ongoing function of relating to the yourself, and this relation to the self is the thing is that I don't think it makes sense to see this relation of the self is an internalized structure that is necessarily governed primarily by language. I think that it's necessary for language to even develop, because it implies certain forms of categorization in terms of having the capacity to unify experience, having the being able to understand relations of other people's experience to your experience, such that then you can make a judgment about whether they're engaged in, whether it's like, whether they're like that, like, it's like, is it a scarecrow blowing in the wind, or is this a person that's actually engaged in a deliberate action? And so there's these forms of sort of, you can think of them as pre-linguistic or whatever, that sort of are necessarily there prior to language. And maybe they're not fully fleshed out. And I think language gives you the capacity to reflect, modify, develop them. But I think that there's a point in which, and I think most importantly, that also what's there, not just before language, but during language, is a reality which gives insight beyond language to whether the language is actually obtaining its end goal, if you will, for me, which is a pragmatic value towards the subject's experience.
So for part of that, so like, is there experience prior to language? I think the answer is going to be yes on both views. Is the role of language to communicate experiences to other people? Well, there's a sense in which that's true, right? Because you've accepted that you accept that people have experiences in some form or another. You accept that there's, in communication, there's an attempt at almost synchronization with others in some way, and kind of so there's a sense in which it's true. I guess maybe the disagreement there is going to be on whether there is like almost like an essential way of those experiences being a correct mental labeling or something, and then that communication consists of getting those correct labelings from one sort of private space to the other private space or something like that.
Not necessarily, because I think you could even like, I think all the way up to the last part, like pretty much, like where one, I would say that the first part, there are definitely Wittgensteinians who would definitely disagree with the idea that an experience happens outside of language. Like they'd say no, like, so like I know Lee, he definitely, like when he wrote Against Liberation, it seems like he definitely thinks animals aren't experiencing.
Yeah. Well, I think anyone who continues to do analytic philosophy after reading Wittgenstein has probably misread the investigations, right? Like he was just encouraging all his students to become psychologists and mechanics. So
yeah, I'm gonna mention that to me. I'm gonna mention that to me philosopher friend and see how he responds as well. I think he's gonna love this. But but yeah, like it's funny, but like it's yeah, sure, but like, so there's that one, so there's that, but like there's then there's the point at the end where you said, like what was it again? So there was the first 2 points, like, so
so in I think where the disagreement is it's something along the lines of maybe that
oh right, yes, because you said like there was this sort of representation, and
there's something about the connection, or the way that experiences represent or something like that. There's something going off there that is like a difference, and I think it might be that for the Wittgensteinian type view, right? Almost the way the experience is sort of unimportant for the way, because the language is this public thing, so it doesn't, you've been trained and socialized as an organism to use words in connection with certain experiences or whatever they are, but the theory doesn't say anything about those experiences somehow being like internally reason giving to use a word in a particular sort of way, or that what's really going on in the act of communication is getting that experience to the other person in the same, so it's the same for them. It's only that successful communication is taking place insofar as you using the words and they take them the way you expect and stuff publicly.
I think I can accept almost all of that in many ways, and then just like, but the way that I'd sort of push back is just to say that it seems to be that, like, in the same sense that it's not about this representation being essentially correct or incorrect, but rather that there would be an ideology or a coherence in beliefs and structures of an individual living a life trying to achieve some sort of goal, in relation to the way in which there's essentially the lived philosophy of an individual, right? In this kind of philosophy that I said in the first instance that Hegel's talking about, like this idea of like, how do you live your life?
Mhm.
Like this sort of structure of your thinking that you can correct through a kind of reflection, and that this sort of reflection is a way of not just like sort of properly, putting things in their place. There is a categorization, like in the sense of like reflecting upon the coherence of like various judgments and decisions you make in your life would be part of it, right?
Mm.
But you end up with this point of an ideology, a truthful ideology. The correct ideology would be the one which creates the most um like pragmatically valuable, in one
Mhm.
respect, experience for the most individuals, not unless, or for the individuals who engage in it, such that one
Mm.
ideology we might lead to a like suffering, maybe
Mm.
extremes of death and things like that, while the other ideology might lead to an experience of what we would say, like in terms of beauty, of satisfaction, of contentment, of well-being.
Mm.
And if we say that's what truth is, right? If we say the truth and beauty are the same, um, then even from this sort of Wittgensteinian position, unless we're saying that, you know, these aren't real, like there isn't this outside of language, there isn't these actual experiences which give meaning to and define the limits of language. I don't think that Wittgenstein can be correct, because there is nothing then that explains why language should be used one way or another, such that there is a pushback in terms of the individual actually having to be motivated to use a word correctly in relation to a social sphere, or even have the need to engage with others in the first place, or internalize this structure, or anything like that, or even be end set
Yeah.
in general.
This is good, and I think that I think that this is sort of the right place to disagree. Um, so yeah, it's the idea is that from the point of view of the Wittgensteinian, yeah, yes, there are experiences outside of language, and then the objection is something like, well, how do we ensure that if experiences are not connected to language in the right sort of way, um, well then it's going to make communication impossible. You won't get people using words in the right way. I think maybe the issue, right, the way that the Wittgensteinian will push back on that and see it is going to be, well, language acquisition, it doesn't come about in the sort of way pictured in the thought experiment here, where there's almost people with any sort of experience and then they attempt to communicate. Instead, it comes about by people being impressed upon by a social community to use words, like trained into using those words in that way, right? And then I think that I mean, there are all sorts of things that might happen. So if you could, you can look at people with children who are learning language, and the children might be a bit confused about, well, when I'm tickled, is that a pain, or is a tickle good, or I thought pain was, but like, because it is kind of complicated, right? Like becoming a person, it does it, and the language is being, or there's cultures that won't even share the same sorts of, there's concepts that exist in one culture and not in another. Are there so the maybe the point is that I think the theory can consistently maintain that there isn't this correct sort of connection, but because the correctness is just going to be what's enforced by the community, right, in the linguistic practice.
Mm-hmm.
And then yeah, someone can go on to use words in a different sort of way if they wanted to, but if it doesn't catch on, or if it leads to sort of so much lack of success that they can't collaborate with others, or they're ostracized, whatever, then they're going to have real issues, and it's just not going to, there's like a selection effect in an almost evolutionary sense built into the
I
way
think
that
that's where like the point
yeah.
is, like, and I
Yeah.
think this is this is probably where we probably should say, like, we're like, this is where the disagreement is, and maybe just like that's where we're probably, it's like and I think that's fine. I guess like my last sort of things would be to say, just what is the training, like, in the sense that, like, how is there training
Mhm.
if there wasn't something that led or coerced the individual into the structure.
The
And
parents.
yeah, but like what essentially how do the parents coerce the child or coerce the individual into the structure of meaning in that respect, right? Such that like there has to be something that there has to be a motivational force.
Well, I think those. I not to keep the conversation just go, but it's like, well, those are in a general sense, right? There's not going to be one answer. But if you ask, like, well, how did these parents do it in some particular case? There is there's a clear answer, right? You just look at what the parents did in fact do. And
I think they're always going to be almost always the same, and I think they're always going to relate to essentially a real biology.
Yeah.
And a real and a real sort of fundamental, even a fundamental psychology.
And that's it's that general. I think there's not going to be. I mean, maybe some things are going to be the same in the sense that you'd say they're all humans, but then human is not going to be characterized in essentialist sense for me, and maybe it would for the other point of view. And
like that's where the conversation would then like
it kind of goes on forever.
And then the second thing would be just to say like what enforces, like why did this sort of why do the culture try to enforce and structure themselves in the first place? Like, why is this happening? And like, why are cultures developing? Why did any of this happen?
Because God caused it, obviously.
Of course, right? No. But like, it's just there's a real teleology. That's essentially what.
I know. Yeah, and I think those are interesting, but I do think that the alternative perspective in each of those cases is basically going to look for like almost particularist answers to those questions, like really heavy on getting the question clear and answering it in specific and that's maybe like the difference in the two views, right? Like I said, obviously it makes sense from your view to look at it this different way, but it's gonna then make appeal to like general principles and things, and then the other view is going to say, oh well, the question of how it in fact happened, well, what do anthropologists say about the start of language? And it becomes like a particular question. So those.
And I think that's just where we're probably going to have to part ways on it. But I mean, it's been fun. I think it's been an interesting and eye-opening like conversation. I wasn't expecting a Wittgensteinian conversation. That's always nice. No one's a Wittgensteinian these days. There's not enough. Well,
that's the selection mechanism, because once you become a Wittgensteinian, you leave philosophy and
that's it. It's but I mean in general, like I think it seems to be like maybe a little bit more popular than it was. It's sort of kind of like philosophy goes through like fads, man. It just always goes through fads. It's painful. Like some of them, like some of the worst philosophies still exist, and I just don't know why. like, but whatever. Like,
sounds like Hegelian.
Yeah, but it's been fun, man. It's been fun, and but yeah, like everyone should definitely check out Digital Gnosis as well in the chat. Like, I'll be uploading this. And like I hope we'll have an engagement again in the future.
And the last question then for you is: does the present King of France wear a wig?
What is it? What's the sort of thing? Like I'll respond like a Laconian. Any king that believes he's a king is as mad as a madman who believes he's a king. Like. So what do you mean, King of France? There is no, but like, what's the whole thing in that again? Like,
that was Russell's famous paper on denoting. I think he said, he's saying that there's this logical way of understanding sentences. So he says, the present King of France is bald. Or it's like, where do you put the negation? Like in front of not the present King of France is bald, or the present King of France is not bald. And he's like, that's the discussion. And then he makes this joke. Hegelians will probably say he wears a wig as like a synthesis.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this: I with a passion hate Bertrand Russell. Like, not even because of what. Have you ever read the history of philosophy and what he?
I have, and look, and I understand. Like, I've got my criticisms of. I think there's a very particular bias and perspective behind his framing. Of course,
he does not understand Hegelianism at all. I fucking hate it. Like, it's actually painful. But okay, But yeah,
So
like
there's some degree like I want to meme on the like Hegelian saying he doesn't understand Hegel, but then when it comes to Wittgenstein, I'm going to say the same thing. Yeah, he's just not misinterpreting Wittgenstein. I've got to be more charitable.
That's the thing. That's the thing. I mean, like, Russell loved Wittgenstein, right? So maybe you just got to defend him for the sake of
Not
it.
in the
You know
end,
what I mean?
though. Not in the end, though, because he goes, Wittgenstein's new philosophy is, it's inimical. It's like soaring off the branch that you're sitting on, and it's all, yeah. So
Oh, like, I mean, like, obviously, like, he thought the Tractatus was like God's gift to
yeah,
philosophy,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So, like, but yeah, man, it's been fun.
yeah. I
And
appreciate it.
I hope we talk again in the future, man. But
Yeah, sure, great.
so have a good one.
Thanks. You too. See you around. Bye, and thanks
Bye.
everyone in the audience.